Okay, I'd now like to shift the focus of the discussion more towards Australia and look at our prospects for optimising our situation given the broadly universal view of the panel that Asia is going to be a good news economic story for a long period of time. And essentially the white paper is premised on the idea that we must move beyond mining and resources towards a much deeper economic integration with Asia, particularly given the middle classing of Asia and all the opportunities that that will create. So I'd like to go back to Michael Chaney. Michael, in your initial remarks, you put some pretty big concerns on the table about this. So can I ask you, how worried are you that at the moment the policy settings in this country are not right to make the transition the white paper talks about?
Well, I'm quite concerned, Paul, that as I touched on briefly, that if we don't manage to lift our productivity, we're going to find it very difficult to achieve any real economic growth. If you look over the last decade, Australia's had, relative to the rest of the developed world, very good economic performance. We've had, acceptable, albeit not spectacular, levels of growth overall. And if you look at where that's come from, at 5 factors, our terms of trade, as we know, were very high. The level of investment in Australia, an increase in the size of our working population, our workforce, and the other 2 factors, capital productivity and labour productivity. The first 3 have driven all of the economic growth in Australia. Capital productivity has been, growth has been very poor, partly because, and this is on the positive side, partly because when you invest in major projects, it takes some time for the income to flow from them, and so the actual capital productivity is depressed. But in addition to that, on the negative side, our capital productivity is lower than it ought to be because of over-regulation and the difficulty of getting projects up, and I think inefficient project management, rushing projects and having costs blow out and so on. And a 5th factor, labour productivity, has simply not, growth has simply not been there. And I believe that one of the reasons for that, and I've said it on many occasions, is that the current industrial relations legislation works against productivity growth. It works against it because when you, in particular, interpose unions between the employer and the employee, you remove incentives for innovation, and people basically, the workforce steps back and says, I'm not the one who's dealing with the employer, and basically accepts what the union works out. This is the inverse of what happened in 1996 when individual agreements were introduced, and employers found that productivity grew far more than they expected because people innovated when they were able to sit down and talk employer to employee about what might be done better. So that was the main point I was making about productivity in growth requirements, but it's a function not only of industrial relations but also of regulation and of appropriate infrastructure development, and the other factor I mentioned was taxation reform, which I think needs to go a lot further than anybody has suggested recently.